Hey everybody, it's your old pal Mike. I hope you're happy, healthy, and safe, and welcome back to the channel for another Jaguar review. This time on the Fender Classic Player Jaguar. This is a pretty cool guitar, but it does have some features that rub me the wrong way, and we'll get to all that in a minute. But before we dig in too deep, I need to say a big thank you to my friends at Mother Mary. Mother Mary is a company that makes great cables and pedals and straps and, yes, even cases, things that I actually use. I've had this case for years at this point. It's the one that I keep my 12 Jag in, and God, I love color so much. And let me tell you, this pink flower thing, this Hawaiian tropical theme, it totally works for me. And so I can't say enough nice things about my friends at Mother Mary, who were so kind as to sponsor this episode. So thank you, Mother Mary. If you are interested in finding out more about their products, visit mothermarycompany.com. Link in the description down below. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's dig into specs. The Classic Player Jaguar features a polyurethane finished 24-inch scale length maple neck with a rosewood board, white dot inlays, and 22 pretty substantial frets. The neck has a somewhat generic yet comfortable C-shaped profile that's neither too big nor too small. The headstock wears import Clouson style tuners and a synthetic nut. The body's finished in a gloss poly sunburst and wears the usual Jaguar controls. We've got a lead circuit with volume and tone, and 3 on-off switches for both pickups as well as the usual strangle switch, and the glorious dark clarity of the rhythm circuit available at the flick of a switch. The guitar features a set of hot Jaguar-style pickups that have plenty of output, but still retain that signature Jaguar charm and sparkle. For hardware, this guitar wears an Adjustomatic bridge and an import vibrato in the modern positioning, which means it's much closer to the bridge than on vintage Jaguars. The guitar is strung with Ernie Ball skinny top, beefy bottoms, gauged 10 to 54, and is tuned to D standard. Now let's come right out of the gate with some things that I love about this model, and the first thing is going to be the neck. This neck is sized to fit a wide variety of hand sizes from large or small. This neck is neither chunky nor is it super fast and thin. I wouldn't say that the shape is kind of vintage inspired, but it's also not ultra modern. It just feels like a comfortable, out of the way C, and for me that's great. Now these 22 medium jumbo frets are indeed quite a bit bigger than I personally prefer. My favorite fret wire is StewMac 148 or equivalent, something that's not super wide but also not super tall. So I will happily admit that it took a little bit of adjustment for me to feel at home and comfortable on this neck, but once I did, it wasn't a big deal. I would say that if you've ever played and enjoyed a shreddy Ibanez neck or a Les Paul with modern frets, this will not be so far off the beaten path as to disturb you. Moving on to another aspect that I'm actually shocked that I like about this guitar, well, it's the pickups. Now, I just measured these, and they come out at a whopping 14K in the bridge and 12 in the neck, which is absurdly hot for a Jaguar pickup. However, while these pickups are hot, and while these pickups are authoritative and have a nice growl to them, they still retain the top end that I expect from a Jaguar. They are wonderfully clear. When paired with overdrive, they get gritty and nasty, but they've got plenty of bite. And, I mean, even with heavier styles of music, these hold up really well. So, yeah, colored me surprised. I did not expect to like these. But here I am, loving them. It's true. I have nothing but nice things to say about these pickups, which is wild when compared with the V-mods that I recently reviewed in the 60s hybrid Jaguar from Japan. These pickups prove that you can wind a Jaguar pickup way too hot and still come out with something that sounds and feels great. So yeah, hats off to Fender on these pickups. I love them. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I'm very happy to see that the CP Jag, although a modern take on the design, still has the rhythm and lead circuit controls. There are a few things that I love as much as engaging the strangle switch to make leads and plucked lines stand out, and the rhythm circuit, that's one of my biggest secret weapons. I absolutely require a rhythm circuit on an offset guitar. On the upper horn of your guitar exists a world of beautiful, blooming, dark clarity. And I just can't say enough nice things. Like, well done on Fender for keeping the vibe alive on the Classic Player. Let's have a listen to what these pickups and the controls can do together. Now, let's talk about some things that I don't like about this model, and these things are absolute sticking points that keep me from loving this model, starting with the bridge. In my humble opinion, the Adjust-O-Matic and Tune-O-Matic bridge is the worst possible option for an offset guitar. And I can hear the clackety-clack of angry commenters now saying, well, if it was good enough for insert my favorite artist, it's good enough for me. And it may be true that your favorite artist did use an Adjust-O-Matic or Tune-O-Matic bridge on their offset guitar. Plenty of people have. But I would push back gently. Is it possible that some things that might work for your favorite artist, as they do for some of mine, may actually be a problem for certain other kinds of players? One of my favorite guitarists, who I'm not going to name in this, has his action about ½ an inch off the fretboard. I would never do that, and it clearly works for him, but that's never going to work for me. I would not be able to play any of his guitars. So what works for my favorite artist may in fact not work for me, and that's okay. When it comes to guitar hardware, we can all enjoy what we enjoy. We can all have preferences. We don't have to split ourselves up into tribes and factions and argue to the death over which bridge is best. We can simply have our opinion, and that's fine with me, because I've got plenty of my own opinions about the Adjust-O-Matic bridge, and we're going to get into it right now. My first issue with an Adjust-O-Matic bridge on an offset guitar is the saddle shape. This saddle shape is not properly designed for a vibrato, at least not from the factory. From the factory, the Adjustomatic and Tune-O-Matic saddle shape just isn't that great for vibratos. They generally have a very steep angle upward toward the leading edge of the saddle, and also plenty of sharp points in the V-shaped groove. All of this means that whenever you actuate your vibrato, the string just isn't going to pull back into its zero position. Allow me to demonstrate. Now this is totally fixable by any capable tech. Any tech worth their salt should be able to gently round over these harsh edges and make this bridge work a lot better for tuning stability with a vibrato or even bending. It's just that from the factory, they're problematic as hell. My next problem with the Adjustomatic, well, let's hear it. That's right, just like a poorly set up stock Jaguar bridge, the Adjustomatic is also prone to its own fair share of rattles and buzzes. Yes, it's true, the Adjustomatic can also suffer from poor fit between the screws and the components into which they are inserted. And yes, they too benefit from some carefully applied Loctite in key areas. There's also the fact that the saddle shape, while generally a little deeper than what's to be found on stock Jaguar bridges, well, sometimes it just isn't deep enough to actually prevent your strings from skipping out of their slots. Case in point, I did that without even thinking about it. That was a no-brainer. Indeed, the B string is now completely off of its saddle, and as I have said so many times before, the key to stopping this is setup. It's not necessarily always about hardware, and the Adjustomatic here just isn't a solution on its own. But the biggest problem that I have with the Adjustomatic bridge on an offset guitar is one of radius. Specifically, the radius mismatch between the bridge itself and the neck. On the Classic Player Jaguar, the radius is 9.5 inches. Now, that's more of a modern Fender thing, but it's not so different from the vintage 7¼ which is my personal preference, that you're gonna feel out of place on it. It does make bending a little bit easier, especially with these bigger frets, but overall, it's still very comfortable for chording. But the Adjustomatic is generally fixed at 12 inches, and that is much flatter than the neck itself. And this means that your strings are not going to match the curvature of your fretboard. Now, this is something that some players may not ever notice, but the fact remains that your D and G strings are always going to be lower in relation to the frets and fretboard than the strings on the outside of the neck, namely your E's. This makes it nearly impossible to set the guitar up for a consistent feel across the fretboard. The inner strings will always require a lot less force to depress than the outer strings. Check this out. I've got the E strings pleasantly high off the fretboard. and sort of not tuned, but the D strings, they buzz wildly all the way up the neck because they're not nearly as high as the E strings. Now, this is a common problem with the Classic Player line, as well as most other offsets that will have a tune-o-matic bridge, and that's simply down to the bridge choice. However, when I was in my fact-finding phase for this review episode, I measured the radius of this bridge not at 12 inches, but actually at 14, so this is even flatter than it generally is. So while there does appear to be some variance in the production of the Adjust-O-Matic bridge, it does bear repeating that with a flatter radius than your neck, your strings will all be at different heights off of the fretboard. Now, this can be addressed in a number of ways. The first, obviously, being just replace the bridge. Just put something else on. You've got the American Pro, a Stay Trem, a Mastery, and a few other bridges that are coming out that will absolutely fit the neck of this guitar so much better than the Adjust-O-Matic. You can also try to file down these saddles to something like a 9.5 or a 10-inch radius to try and get closer to what the neck is reflecting. But because of the design of this bridge, you're going to have to remove so much material on your outer strings that you may in fact cause other issues, namely buzzing and rattling against the bridge base itself. I have worked on a ton of these Classic Player Jaguars and Jazzmasters over the years, and almost every one of those owners requested a bridge change. And once we did that, the guitar felt more consistent, more playable, more predictable, and the setup was perfect. So, look, I'm not telling you you have to do it, but it is a very good option. Oh, did you think we were done with complaints yet? We got another one for you. The next one is the modern vibrato placement. This is a feature that kind of messes with the vibe of a Jaguar, if I'm honest. And as we saw in a recent video on this channel, where I actually moved the vibrato backward and forward on the same body, this one right here, we found that the closer positioning actually makes the guitar feel a little bit more taut. It reduces compliance, i.e. how easy it is to bend the strings across the fretboard, and it also kind of messes with the behind the bridge notes that I so depend on. These are things that are really important to me. They may not matter to you so much, and that's okay if they don't. You are absolutely free to enjoy your guitar. But if you're like me and you're used to the vintage vibrato placement, this is not necessarily going to improve your experience. So wait, why did Fender change this in the first place? Well, conventional thought on the matter tells us that moving the vibrato a little bit closer to the bridge actually increases the break angle. Simply put, the break angle is just the angle at which the strings hit the bridge and flow over the saddles down the neck. Break angle is something that we should all be paying attention to when we're setting up our guitars. That can increase tuning stability, it can increase transference and resonance, and, you know, when it comes to keeping the strings in their saddles, it generally helps. In fact, break angle is probably the reason that a lot of people think Jaguars and Jazzmasters are flawed. It's always a matter of setup, and Leo Fender designed these guitars to have an angled neck via shims and a raised bridge. That's how that break angle and downward force on the bridge is generally achieved. In the Classic Player line, Fender chose to move the vibrato forward a little bit to increase the break angle, at least that's what I've heard. But does it actually help? As I proved in the video that I mentioned earlier, moving the vibrato less than an inch closer to the bridge really doesn't change things all that much. In fact, on the Classic Player line and many other guitars with the modern vibrato placement, there's another feature that's doing the heavy lifting. I'm about to blow the lid off this joint. That feature is an angled neck pocket. Yes, indeed, the Classic Player has an angled neck pocket. When I had the neck off for the initial setup that I did on this guitar, I took measurements of the neck pocket, and you can see clearly that it rises toward the neck pickup. That little bit of a rise introduced at the factory level is what is actually contributing to increased stability on this bridge. And as you saw earlier, it's still not quite enough to keep strings from falling out of their saddles. Now, Fender angling the neck pocket at the factory is not a bad thing at all. In fact, I would argue it's a very good thing. Sometimes I feel like they maybe introduce a little bit too much angle in certain models like the American Pro, but I'm glad they're doing it because it takes the guesswork out of setup. You don't have to mess with shimming and finding the exact right amount of angle. It's basically already there for you. It should be noted, however, that angling the neck pocket is literally the only way that Fender could fit this very tall Adjustomatic bridge on this body. If you look closely at this bridge, you can see there's really not a whole lot of room left for adjustability downward. That's also the reason that there's an extra cutout in the pickguard around the body inserts. That's because the bridge is so tall that to get it low enough for comfortable action, well, we've got to go beneath the level of the guard. So really, when it comes to stability and the quote-unquote improvements made on the Classic Player, it is a combination of elements at work here and not simply one or the other. It's not just the tune-o-matic, it's not just the modern vibrato position, it's the angled neck pocket as well. So, are all of these things going to be important to every player in the world? No, but they're worth mentioning because they are changes that do affect the way the guitar feels, plays, and sounds. And to be sure, it's a fun guitar. I have enjoyed my time with this particular Classic Player. I'm not saying that I hate it. It's just that there's some features here that make it not a great option for me personally. But I'm sure you're all wondering, well, does he recommend this? No, not really. I think there's some good stuff here. Like I said, I really enjoy the pickups. I love the way the neck feels. The weight's pretty nice. It looks smart. It's got the right controls. But when it comes to the Adjustomatic bridge and the modern vibrato placement, that makes them guitars that I don't readily recommend for most players. Truth be told, in its stock form, I just think there are better offset guitars out there. There are other models that I would point you to, like the Road Worn, or the Squire CV, or an American Pro, or, you know, an American Original, something like that. However, if you've got one, you shouldn't feel bad, and if you love it, that's great. You don't necessarily have to make any adjustments or hardware changes to get a good experience out of this guitar, especially those of you who don't even worry about the vibrato. Maybe you treat this like a Les Paul Special and you just rock away on it, and hey, that's great if that's you. So while I can see that there's a market for this guitar, I just don't think this collection of elements is all that well executed. Oh, also, did I mention that the screw-in arm is very noisy? Yeah, this guitar needs a little work, and I'm looking forward to doing said work. Like I said, we'll be replacing the bridge and vibrato with Mastery hardware, and I'll be doing some setup tweaks to try and make this thing play its absolute best. Anyway, I hope this review has been helpful and informative, especially to those of you who maybe have been looking at the Classic Player Jaguar as one out of many Jaguar options. Once again, I'd like to say thank you to Mother Mary for sponsoring this review episode. I could not have done it without you. I'm such a big fan of Mother Mary. Again, please check out their work. As always, thank you for liking, for sharing, for commenting, for subscribing, for clicking the bell, for smashing the subscribe, whatever you're supposed to do on this godforsaken platform. I do appreciate you doing it so much. Another big thanks to my supporters on Patreon who are giving me life every single day of the week. If you are interested in learning what you can do to support the channel, please hit the Patreon link in the description down below. All right, well, I've got some work to do on this guitar, and I'm really excited to do it, so I'm gonna get to that. In any case, I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you in the next video.